What's up everybody, I'm Matt Gary, and on this episode of Coding with the Force, I'm going to show you how to use Nebula Logger to make your error logging and your debug logging much easier to deal with in Salesforce. Alright. So today we're going to go over Nebula Logger, which is an incredibly well-made open source library made by Jonathan Gillespie. I think that's how you pronounce his name. And I believe it's been contributed quite a bit to by James Simone as well. So all of my videos I start pretty much the same way, right? Which is, why would you care to use the thing that I'm going to attempt to teach you about here in just a second. As far as why you would care to do Nebula Logger or learn Nebula Logger or any of that, it's because if you've worked with Salesforce enough, you would probably know that you can get yourself into some pretty challenging debug log situations. Salesforce kind of just combines all of the junk into one giant debug log, or to make it worse, if you have Aura and Lightning web components in your page, splits them out into a bajillion different logs, which makes it even harder to deal with. So especially once you get into installing a lot of managed packages in your org, your debug logs and logs in general can just get bogged down with tons of junk that you don't care about and don't want to look at. So what this does is it makes a nice and easy way to kind of house all that stuff in the same place. And I'm going to show you just how to install it and a couple of examples that I've already pre-built. I will go over them and what they mean and all that kind of junk, so that you can see the usefulness of Nebula Logger and hopefully start using it in your org. So the first thing I'm just going to show you really quick before we get into how to install this is what Nebula Logger looks like. So one of the most important concepts that I want to get into your head, I suppose, is that you're going to use this like you would use System.debug, right? Normally to do a debug log, you'd use System.debug. Now you'll change that up a bit and use logger.warn or debug or info or fine or finest or whatever. And you can do this in flows too, by the way. It's been made so that you can leverage flows in the same way, which is pretty cool. And in process builders, I guess. Process builders are essentially flows too, though, in the background. Okay. So this is the Nebula Logger console. So they have created a console app to allow you to check out your Nebula Logger logs. Let me see if I can get a really good example in here that has child logs. I don't know if I have any left. Okay, I do. All right, so this is an example of a log that gets generated. So this is the equivalent in normal Salesforce of a debug log that you get generated at the end of code execution. It's the equivalent of this guy that you'd get in your logs area, right? In the developer console. You double click your log, it'd pop up, take forever to load, and it houses all this information in here, right? What you are theoretically building in your code using Nebula Logger is a very similar thing, except for it houses a whole lot of data in a much easier and nicer to read format, and it only houses the data that you want to see and care about, not all the other junk that Salesforce logs in the background or managed packages log in the background or whatever else, right? So here is an example of a log, and again, that just represents your regular old debug log. This is the housing component, or the housing record in our case. And this tells you a handful of things: the number of log entries, these guys, that exist for it, how many are errors and how many are warnings, things, the retention date of this log, how long it will last before it gets automatically cleaned up, the default, the user that ran this and their specific settings, the org that you ran this in. If you ran this in Experience Cloud, it'd give you some stuff on that. And then it'd give you session-based settings in other scenarios as well. It also has the ability to, when you create a log, creates log entries. So a log entry, by the way, would be the equivalent of each of these lines in here, right? Each one of these lines is an entry in the larger debug log. Okay? Cool. So we've got these log entries, and if you click into them, you'll see that they house some pretty interesting things. It lets you know what logging level it is. It lets you know what order it was logged in. Was it the first, second, third, fourth entry? It lets you know where it happened. So this happened in my Apex Nebula component controller, and it happened in the log warning method. And it also tells me the message that I sent to it. This is one of the only things you fill out. The stack trace for it, the exact line that it happened on, and the limits at this moment in time when you logged it, which is super useful. You don't even get that in Salesforce logs typically. So yeah, lots of really cool stuff. The other thing that you can do is link a log to another log. So link a child log to a parent log, right? And this is super cool and useful when it comes to trying to figure out when an Aura component called, Aura component method A, and then it called method B, C, D. You have the ability to link all these logs together through the use of the session cache, which I'll get into in just a little bit. And it's just incredibly useful for making it a lot easier to know which debug logs relate to which, method that got invoked by your Lightning Web component. And last but not least, you can use topics to further refine your logs if you want to. And you can have these topics get auto-filled out by your code. I don't believe this is actually available in flows, even though it's an available option. It doesn't look like it's in use yet. So maybe in a future release, but not quite yet. You can use it in Apex though. So just so you know, this is how it looks. That's how it's just pretty useful. You can also generate a JSON file to represent it if you want to, for one reason or another, maybe to export to another system. I have no idea. Yeah, so we've looked at this. You can see how useful it is and how it cuts down on things and how you can easily link logs together, which is something that is completely impossible to do in Salesforce, out of the box. So let's just get into how to actually install this in your org. So you have a couple options with Nebula Logger. You'll go to the GitHub page, which I'll link in the description of this video. And then you can install the unlock package or the manage package. Both myself and the creators suggest using the unlocked package. It's the one that gets updated most frequently. It's easier to deal with, in my personal opinion, than any manage package, because you can actually look at the code and make adjustments if you feel you need to make adjustments. I don't think you will, but and you should be careful about that, because when they release upgrades, yours might not be compatible if you override their code. But either way, I'm going to go the unlock package route, and I think you should too. And you can see they recommend it. So we're going to install this unlock package, and it's going to bring us to a normal package installation screen, one that you guys have probably seen plenty of times. And what I would suggest is to install this for administrators only. Chances are pretty high that it's only going to be your administrators or an administrator equivalent that's going to be messing with any of this stuff anyway. Normally this would be a installation button instead of an upgrade button, but since I already have it installed in my org, it's an upgrade button. Feel free to click install. It's going to take a few minutes, probably 5 to 6 minutes to install in your org. So, pause, come back, and we'll keep on keeping on. All right, so pending you've got that installed, there's a couple of setup steps that you'll want to do. The first one is finding your user. You know, you can get to it by searching, or you can get to it just by going to Settings in Advanced User Details. And you will want to give yourself the logger admin permission set. And there are several other pre-built permission sets: logger end user, logger creator, log viewer. All of these are described in great detail over on the GitHub page, and you can decide which users you'd like to give these permission sets to. But for the purposes of this video, to make things easy, let's just go on ahead and assign yourself the logger admin permission set. Cool. So we got that done. We got the logger admin permission set up. The next thing that we'll want to do is go to custom settings. So I guess I've already typed that in. We'll go to custom settings and setup and go to this logger settings custom setting. And hit manage. And in here, normally there's not going to be anything that shows up if you've just installed Nebula Logger. So what you'll want to do is hit edit, and these will all just get pre-filled out with these default values that you see in front of you. I'd say just leave them as they are, but if you have specific needs that are different, like you want to give everybody edit access, you can change this from read to edit. You could change your log retention days to just 1 instead of 14, or you could change it higher or lower to whatever number. You could change your save method to event bus or queuable or rest. There are different ways to have Nebula Logger save its results, and you may need one over another in your certain situation. You can change this at runtime in your Apex code, so it's not necessary to necessarily change it here unless you know for a fact it's going to work better in your system as a queuable or a REST invocation. And then just feel free to leave these as they are. You'll want is enabled checked for sure. And if you want to change the default level of log, you can to either error, warn, info, debug, fine, finer, or finest. I'm just going to leave them as they are for now, but you can change those default org level settings. And you can also make these for each individual user or a group of people through the use of a profile. So if you wanted these to be different for your specific running user, if you didn't like the org defaults and you wanted yours to be edit or 2 days or something different, then you can do that. So you've got a nice level of granularity for each individual person that uses Nebula Logger. They can use it in their own way if they'd like to. Okay, cool. So we've gone over kind of how Nebula Logger works. We've kind of gone over the setup. Oh, there is one more thing in setup. If you do want to use topics with Nebula Logger, you have to enable topics. I'm not going to go over what topics are. That's a whole thing in Salesforce. Deserves its own video, but I'm going to show you really quick how to enable them. If you want to use it, you do have to go to Classic to enable topics. You can use them in Lightning, but you have to enable them in Classic. And you'll go to Topics, Topics for Object, find the log and log entry object, and just click the Enable button up here. Normally, it wouldn't be enabled. I've already enabled this in my org, but you'd have to click Enable Topics and then the Save button down here for both objects. And yeah, that does it for the setup. So let's get into the next things that we'll cover. We'll cover a code example. We will cover how to use the logger in place of the Apex debug log in your code, how to link your different Aura transactions to link the logs for those Aura transactions together to one master log, and how to use flows to do logs, and how to potentially use flows to, or like save your flow logs in your Apex logs all in the same overarching log file. So let's get into that really quick. Let me bring up some code. I'm going to show you this example here. Ooh. And we're just going to go over it. I tried coding this. It's too long for me to code this whole thing for one video, but I'm going to go over exactly what we're doing here. So I've created this component. It's called the Nebula component. And basically I've created a connected callback that sets up our session cache, which I'll go over why I'm doing that in this Aura component in a bit. You don't have to do that in general for Nebula Logger, by the way. You don't have to work with the session cache at all, but I'm just going to show you how you can leverage both Nebula Logger and the session cache together to really start making some cool stuff. And then log debug, log warning, and I've basically just got two buttons on here that allow me to click them and execute this code, which then calls my Apex controller, Nebula component controller, and actually logs this stuff for me. Okay, so let's just go over a couple things in here. Let's go over the basics first. So I've got this log warning method, and this log warning method, when I click this log a debug warning, is called, right? And the JavaScript method then calls out to my Apex controller, and my Apex controller says, okay, I want to create a new debug log entry that has the value, this is a warning debug log, and then this is effectively the same thing, except for I'm assigning it to a log entry builder variable, or a log entry builder variable that logs both another message and logs it against a specific record, the record ID that I pass in, which has its own really cool thing that I'll show you in just a bit. And then it also sets topics. So let me explain, I guess, what's going on. Once you install Nebula Logger, you get access to this logger class, right? And there's an enormous amount of overloaded methods within that logger class that allow you to create info logs, warning logs, debug logs, error logs, etc., right? And you can basically do whatever you want with those. You can send it a list of S-object records, a single S-object, just a record ID. You can send it save results, merge results, delete results, etc., etc. So that's why there's all these overloads, right? There's an overload for virtually anything that you could get yourself into. So you're going to basically create your debug log entry. And again, if we go back to our regular debug log in Salesforce, that equates to one of these line items. So when you say logger.warn or logger.find or logger.whatever, you're creating one of these entries, one of these line items. And you're just adding the message like you would in a normal System.debug. So if you were doing this normally, you would say System.debug. This is a warning debug. And instead, you're now using logger.warn, right? So the difference between this line, logger.warn, and logger, or in this line 17, where I actually assign logger.warn to a variable, it's just that I'm assigning logger.warn to a variable. Each one of these logger.warn calls, or logger.whatever, returns to you a log entry event builder object. And This is only super important to use, I would say, if you intend to use topics. So there's no way to set topics for one of your log entries unless you do log event.setTopics, right? So you have to actually assign this log warn to a log event entry builder and then do log event.setTopics and send it a new list of strings with your incorrectly spelled warning string to add for your topic. If you don't really want to use topics or have no intent, then you probably aren't ever going to get yourself into this situation, at least at this point in time with Nebula Logger, because pretty much everything else is accessible just through the method overloads that have been given to you. But I wanted to show you that example because there isn't actually an example of this in the GitHub. I just kind of figured out how to do this on my own. I don't believe that there's there might be actually in the I forget, there's actually a page that goes over each class and the different methods, but there's not just like a simple example shown. Okay, so that's what those are. That's when you'll create logger.warn. So maybe you really in your code be like inserting a new account. So, you know, say you created an account equals new account name equals hi or something, and then you inserted the account and you wanted to say this is a warning debug log plus account ID or something. You would just use them just like you would a regular old debug log, right? Except for you got a lot more granularity and you're only going to get what you decide you want, right? Not just all the things that Salesforce wants to give you. Okay, I'm going to remove this because I don't actually want to do this. And I'm going to go down to this one where I'm effectively doing the same thing, but I just want to reiterate it. I'm doing logger.debug, you know, to create an entry in my debug log. Now, there's a thing that I'm doing here that's that I'm not explicitly doing in this method that I'm just going to add in here really quick before I go any further. And that's if you want to, if you're at a point where you want to actually save all of your logs that you have created within your executional context or within your code at this moment in time, you would say logger.savelog. And logger.savelog is going to actually send out your platform event or invoke the queuable or do the REST call. By default, it's a platform event though, to you know, go out and actually save the logs that you've set up, right? So it's going to go out and save these two log entries underneath a log record for me. But I've got this save Nebula log method set up to kind of do that and illustrate a few other points that I want to get into. So I mentioned earlier that one of the cool things, at least that I've found that you can use Nebula Logger for that is impossible to do with regular debug logs in Salesforce is to link your, you know, different Aura method invocations together. So if you didn't know, when if I was looking at this component on a page and I clicked the log warning button, right, and it eventually called that log warning method, this acts in its own executional context, as in it's in its own little world, unaware of anything else. And when I click the log debug one, it executes in its own context, in its own little world, without anybody else. And because of that, they create two separate logs. And they're not linked together. The logs aren't linked together in any way, so you don't really know, like, this happened because of this component, or this happened because of that component, or whatever else, right? Especially when you have components like communicating to each other over and over in different ways, it can be kind of hard to figure out which component created log A or B or C. But if you use a session cache with Nebula Logger, you can link them all together. There's nothing really on this topic that I've found out there. There's not even anything on the GitHub page, but I wanted to go over this because you can use it this way and it's pretty useful. So the way that I like to set this up anyway is I use the session cache, which, by the way, if you've never used it, is pretty simple. You do have to set it up first. So you will have to go to and set up platform cache and create a partition. So you'd go to platform, or you'd go to setup platform cache. By default, this is going to have nothing in it. And if you don't create a platform cache partition down here, it's going to complain to you and say, hey man, you've got to fix that. And what you'll want to do is just create a default partition. You can get more specific than this, but to make it really easy, just create a default partition and give it at least one provider-free session cache allocation. And once you've done that, wow, it took me back to classic, interesting. Once you've done that, you'll be able to use a session cache in your code. If you don't do that, it's going to error out and say, hey, you don't have session cache set up, so you suck. But what this allows you to do is cache values in a map for an individual user's session in Salesforce. So what this allows you to do is say, for this user, when this component loads, keep this value in their session cache through all executional contexts, right? So unless this user reloads the page or whatever else, let's keep it in this same executional context. Now you'll probably want to do a little more than what I'm doing right here to make sure that your logs stop logging after a while. Like a user could leave a tab open and leave it there for 15 minutes and then come back to it and start logging against the same thing again. Or maybe you want to leave it this way. I don't know, but it's up to you. But let me just explain what's happening. So on the setup of basically as soon as my component is loaded into the screen, I'm calling this method called setup cache in my Apex controller. And all setup cache does is let me know that, hey, this component was loaded in and this is a new load, right? I know that this component just loaded at this point. And whenever I call my log warning or my log debug, I eventually call this save Nebula Log method. And in the save Nebula Log method, I look to see, hey, let's get our cached session value is new load, which is what I created up here, right? Simple. I just made the key is new load and gave it a Boolean value of true. And down here, I'm grabbing is new load and using that key, right? I'm grabbing that Boolean value from that key. And I'm saying if it's a new load, then let's get the Nebula Logger transaction ID. And what this is, if I open back up the logging console, is this. It's kind of like an external ID, but basically it's just a way to know, a way for Nebula Logger to know to link itself to a parent log. So whenever my code says get transaction ID, this is the field it's looking at and what it's getting. And that'll be filled out as soon as you start saying logger dot whatever. As soon as you say logger dot get transaction dot ID, it's going to have a value. So I'm saying Nebula Logger, logger.get transaction ID. So let me get that transaction ID. And let's, if this is a new load of my component, let's put that Nebula Logger transaction ID into a session, into the session cache map. And then here, let's inform our session cache that it's no longer a new load, right? We've already loaded, we've set up our basically top level parent transaction ID or our top level parent log record. And yeah, that's it. And let me just remove this for the moment because this is this part down here is getting into flow stuff that we'll get to in a second. And then we'll just save the log. And now next time that we click either one of these buttons to log debug or log a warning, it's going to say, okay, we're not a new load, so let's go down here and let's get our Nebula ID, our parent Nebula ID record. So the one that we put into our session cache up here. And let's set the parent log transaction ID. So what that means is it's going to set the parent for this new log that we're saving now, for this brand new log. And it's grabbing that one from the session cache and putting it in here. So it exists between those executional texts, and we're linking our Nebula logs together. And then let's save our log. So let me just show you how this ends up working, because it's pretty cool in my opinion. I can't believe how well it ends up working, I suppose. So let me delete this because I think this is a different example that I set up. Nebula component is what I want in here. So I'm just adding my component that we were just looking to a account record page. If you don't know much about Lightning App Builder, I would suggest just checking out Trailhead. If you don't know about how to create a Lightning Web Component to drop onto a Lightning App Builder page, I have a whole tutorial that's called creating a Lightning Web Component with custom metadata that goes over in detail all that stuff. So I'll link it too. All right, so we've got those buttons, the thing we were just looking at and talking about. So we've got this JavaScript component, Nebula component in there, and we will just click log a debug warning. And then we'll come back over to this tab, which is the logger console, and reload this, and hopefully we now have 19 items, and we do. And we'll click on this and see what we get. So right now, log 18 has got our 2 log entries, which is great. This is a warning debug log, and this is a warning debug log for that account. And you can see it's got that related account that we put in there. So let me go back and show you what I mean. This is a warning log for a record, right? And it linked that record ID, which it did. And right now it has no child logs, but in just 1 second, when we click log a regular debug log, if we reload this, thanks to the session cache, we will have a child log. So we can see every user interaction with this component since it's been loaded, right? And it'll all get linked back together underneath one larger parent log. So it gives you like an enormous amount of paths that it could have taken to get things done. Or it gives you, that's the wrong thing to say. It gives you all of the information for a user's interaction with that single component, right? Like you can see everything in that parent log now that has happened underneath that component, and it all gets tied together, and you don't lose it between the mini debug logs that get popped up like happened in the dev console, right? Like Look at all these debug logs. Which one is linked to which? I don't know. I really don't. There's nothing that tells me. There's nothing easily notable about those. I don't know. And where did these what did the platform cache things come from and topic setup? I mean, I know where they came from, but they're just not as relevant as the logs that I've clearly generated here, right? The other thing that's important is we actually did get that topic that we assigned, the warning topic, right? And in the child log entries, we got the danger topic that we set up in the code, which you can see here, warning, danger. Okay, so one other thing I want to go over before we get into flows really quick. The flows will be quick and simple because they're pretty easy to set up. It's just that you could see how in this log entry that we have in a related record since we sent in that record ID. And that related record is, it's great. It's great that we have it. And the reason that it's great that we have it is because there is a custom related list component that you can add to your objects that show you the log entries for that particular record. So you can just through the, again, you can edit the record page for whatever object you're on. For me, that's the account record page. So I'm going to edit it really quick. And if you wanted this related list to be here, this log entries related list that shows you every time that your particular record had a debug log or an error log linked to it, then you would scroll down to custom, and there is a related log entries component, and this just comes with Nebula Logger after you install it, and you just drop it on there. And it's got a couple of settings. It'll ask you the maximum number of log entries to display. I wouldn't display more than like a few hundred personally, otherwise data tables get really freaked out and start to slow down. And yeah, you can, I always just set this to related list defaults. I'm not going to lie, I actually haven't looked into what the different options are for this. So yeah, there you go. You just drop that on there, and then you know on a record by record basis the different logs that have been generated for it, which is pretty cool. So yet another very useful thing that you definitely couldn't get out of the box with Salesforce. They don't provide that in any way. All right, so last but not least, let's go over the flows. The flows are really easy to set up. So I've got this flow that's kind of just pre-baked for us. You can use what I'm about to show you in any flow type. It doesn't matter whether it's a record triggered flow or a screen-based flow or whatever else. You can use them wherever if you want to use them. Basically all you're going to do is grab an action, drag it onto your flow layout, click on this logging area, and you're going to select one of the 4 available options. Add log entry, which is just a general log entry, can do most things, like it can still link a record through the use of a record ID. And it can save from within this add log entry, but I'll tell you why you may or may not want to do that in a bit. You can add log entry from an S-object record, so like an actual record instead of just an ID. Add one through, add a log entry for a collection of records, and then actually save your log. So if we look at add log entry, basically in here you're going to put a label like you would for any action. This can be any name, it doesn't really matter. You're going to just type in or use a variable that you've declared, the name of your process builder, or flow. So that would literally be Nebula Logger Flow. You would put in your log entry message. This is the same as in Apex, like the message that's right here, right? It's basically your debug log message. If you wanted a fault error message, like if your flow fails to add an error message, you could click include, and then just type in your error message here. If you wanted a different default logging level, you could click include here and then change this from whatever the default is, or you could just put in really whatever you wanted. So it could be warn, could be error, etc. Just type it in there. If you had the record ID being captured by your flow, then you could click include, find the variable that held your record ID and place it in here. And then if you wanted to save your log right now, you could click this and put the value true in here, and then it would save your log right here from this flow, or from this save add log entry action. Cool. It says the topics work, although I don't think that they actually do. It doesn't appear that they're actually being used in the code at the moment. I'm imagining this will be available in a future state, or maybe I've just never used it for flow and it somehow is working, but it doesn't appear to be working at the moment in the code, so I'm just gonna state that. I might be wrong. Maybe they can correct me. Anyway, after you set up your action, you're just going to place it on, connect it to your triggered flow, and then you will connect it to a save log action once you're all done, which is pretty cool. That's all you have to do. For this save log action, you really have to do nothing except for name it. So I guess I can just show you that really quick. If I go to logging, save log, all you have to do is give it a label. That's it. It's going to do everything else for you in the background. And just so you know, you can, in your code, right? So back here in the code, I'm going to run both of them here in just a second by saving an account. So I'm going to just save an account here in a second so that I trigger this flow. But just so you are aware, you can logger.save log here and save the log here. And because all of it happens in the same executional context, Nebula Logger is smart enough to put it all in the same log. So let me show you what I mean. If we save this component, go back over here and reload this, and click either one of these buttons, log a warning, log a debug. You're going to see, once I refresh the logger console, that there's now only 24 items. There was 23, now there's 24. And you can see that we got the flow log in this log, and we also got the Apex logs in here. So it logged it all in the same log file, which is pretty awesome, right? Thanks to it existing in the same executional context, it all did it together. Same thing goes for process builders. If you save your log in a process builder and a flow and a trigger, because it all happens in the same executional context, Nebula Logger is smart enough to know, hey, it was in the same context, let's put it all in the same log file, or log. Let's link the log entries to the same log record. So pretty cool, pretty cool, pretty cool. I think that's pretty much it. There was a lot to unpack there. I'm not going to go over the process builders. You can use this in process builders too. But you're really, these days, not supposed to be using process builders. So I'm not going to push them any more than I can, or than I need to. But you can set them up in process builders. There's documentation over that elsewhere. And yeah, if you have any questions, definitely let me know. Leave them in the comments. If you liked the video, subscribe. And if you want to know when new things are happening, press the bell icon so you know. And don't forget to vote on next week's video so that you get to see what you want to see. Otherwise, somebody else is going to vote on it, and you're going to see what they want to see. So go vote. I hope I haven't forgotten anything. These are the major things, at least for Nebula Logger, that make it so awesome, in my opinion. So, yeah, that's it. I'll see you guys next time.